Welcome, everyone. I'm glad we had this chance to talk. A great step forward always begins with a small step. That's what I think we've done today. But I'm Mark Schar, and my co-professor here is Jeremy Sabol. And today we're going to talk about thinking. We're going to talk about design thinking, and we're going to explore the uses of design thinking, because as you know, as we've thought about thinking, design thinking is a tool, and it's the single most valuable tool you can have for problem solving. And it's the kind of process that once you know it, it's applicable in all situations, and it's the best tool you can use for thinking. Isn't that right, Jeremy?
But Mark, I have to interrupt. You know that I love design thinking. You and I like to talk about it together. But is it really? Can you really use it for everything?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, everything.
I mean,
everything.
Well, Mark, just this morning I was making my coffee, and I was trying to.
Yeah.
I was redefining, and then I was ideating, and there was coffee grounds all over the kitchen, and I woke my wife up, and
you made a prototype cup of coffee.
I did, and that's now all over my pants, and I'm just not convinced that design thinking solves every single kind of problem.
Well, of course it does. Well, I don't know. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe design thinking is a useful tool, but the real trick here is figuring out when to use design thinking and when not to use design thinking. Would you like to talk about that this morning?
I would like to talk about that, Mark.
All right. Well, let's go to the next slide. And what we're really talking about is problem solving. Oops, let's go back one for a second. We're talking about problem solving. And as you know, the world is full of problems, and we as human beings are drawn to solve those problems. I spend most of my time with engineers, teaching young engineers. And engineers, if you ask them, how would you describe engineering abstractly, they would say, yeah, it's all about problem solving. And they solve problems, and they get grades for solving problems. But it's that problem-solving process they go through that ends up having an important impact on the way they think. And so it's this interplay between thinking and problem-solving that we're going to talk about today. So if you go to the next slide.
Right.
The next slide is a wonderful article which we can make available to you. It was written by a fellow that's a lecturer here at Stanford. His name is Kingshuk Das, and they said he's a lecturer, but he also is quite active in industry. And he recently wrote an article called Strategic versus Design Thinking. And this article was important because it illustrates the advantages and disadvantages of both approaches. If you go to the next slide, Jeremy, he started off by saying, well, what is overthinking? And we've all experienced this. Overthinking is sort of death by analysis, or it's also called analysis paralysis. And that's where you have this obsession to minimize risks, to not make a mistake. And that leads to an inability to make any decision, and certainly make a decision fast enough to respond to what the marketplace or the environment may require of you. This is a challenge that's often associated with strategic thinking, where people plan, but they never actually do. Kind of a funny way of saying this is, if you've heard of ready, aim, fire, is the way in which you plan. Well, strategic thinking can also be ready, aim, 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 but you never fire. Strategic thinking also lends itself to having things fall into boxes. What you see on this slide is something called, it's a thinking process called cascading choice structuring. And you can see where you start with the big idea, which is what are we trying to do, what is winning. You then translate that into goals, so how are we going to measure winning. What comes out of that is a strategy, how do we win, and then finally that turns into plan. And it's very orderly. It goes from the big ideas to the more granular plans. It's very comforting to business executives, and it's a perfectly legitimate kind of thinking. But if you never make it to plans, if you never make it to that last box, it's a lot of paralysis. It doesn't get you to where you need to go. On the other hand, there's our friend, if you go to the next slide, which is what we call design thinking. And this is often a case where you find underthinking. In design thinking, as we taught it to you, the very first rule is to defer judgment, is to not decide until you have to decide, and then even don't decide then. In other words, keep your options open, keep the problem space open as long as you possibly can. And the advantage of this approach clearly is that a new idea that comes out of that process, a new and novel idea, is something that is what people seek. The challenge, of course, is that new ideas and novel ideas may not be worth much. And so what happens is you end up with this stream of new and novel ideas that are costly. They don't really generate enough revenue and profit to make themselves worthwhile. And that you have this problem where big companies, like, say, for example, Procter & Gamble, can invest its time and energy into chasing novel, interesting, but small ideas. And you're familiar with the architecture of design thinking, which has, by the way, lots of activity in it. It's an iterative process where you start with empathy, you define the solution, you ideate, you build a prototype, and you test, and you're constantly iterating through the steps. And while it's a very effective tool for what I would call ideation and novel new ideas, it doesn't always necessarily lead to good and profitable ideas. Is there anything you want to add to these two, this over and under thinking architecture, Jeremy?
No, I think this is great, Mark. I just think it's nice when we think about it in this terms that we see kind of what they both offer, but really what the vulnerabilities that both of them have. I mean, we can see clearly here what problems you might have with both of these methods. So this is great.
So if you go to the next slide, this is a slide that you have been part of T500 have seen before, but it's really what we call the heart of design thinking. I would also call it successful thinking, where we try to bring three domains together. We bring the domain of technology together and think of that as maybe engineering thinking. We then marry that with human values, which can be design thinking, if you will, the empathy and redefinition parts of design thinking. And then finally, the viability, the business thinking that goes on. Is this going to be big enough to really make a difference? And it's when we get all three of those working together that we really have success. We fancy this as design thinking, but you can imagine in each one of those domains, they're probably sensitive to a type of thinking that may not be exactly what we've described as design thinking. And so if you go to the next slide is a place you should remember. It's the D-School at Stanford. But you'll also recognize, and in fact, many engineering professors would agree with this, that it's really the home of underthinking. It's the home of half-baked ideas and crazy things that'll never amount to anything. And on one level, they're very right. It is. That's what design thinking does. But on another level, as we know, it can be a very important way to solve difficult and knotty problems. If you turn to the next slide, it really comes down to this simple graphic, which sort of compares, strategic thinking with the cube, or with the design thinking with the cube, and strategic thinking with the checkboxes. They're not the same. They really aren't. And in fact, the message of today, and the message we thought we would open up for discussion in this webinar, is what are the different kinds of thinking, and when might they be appropriate to use? And while we're very proud and eager users of design thinking, we also recognize its limitations. So we thought we'd talk a little bit about that. You want to add anything here, Jeremy?
Oh, no. No, I think let's move on here, Mark.
Okay. Well, this next slide begins to illustrate some of the different thinking styles that we practice in. One of the areas where I teach, we teach students how to think like engineers, how to solve engineering problems. And engineers view the world as a process of solving, and they solve their way forward into answers. The tools they use are equations and analytical thinking in that process. And the goal of engineering thinking is what we call single point answers. In fact, it's so single point that when they get to the answer, they're expected to draw a box around it. And of course, a box is a closed symbol, and that is the right and appropriate answer. There's another kind of thinking that I'm very familiar with. I spent most of my career in this area, and that's called business thinking or business problem solving. And business people really look to optimize things. So they look to optimize their way forward. The tools they use are tools that lead to sort of one of two states, either a maximal state, maximizing, or a satisficing state. And what that means is that they will look for, in some cases, the best answer that they can possibly have. But there are other times when they're quite comfortable looking for an answer that's good enough, that just is good enough. And in fact, they would tell you that the heart of strategy is being able to choose which issues you hope to find a maximal solution and which issues you hope to find a good enough solution. And they're quite comfortable with multiple answers and living with multiple answers, or multiple sufficient answers. There's a third kind of thinking, which we've touched on this morning, and that's what we call design thinking, design problem solving. And we like to think that this is an area where you build your way to a solution. You build your way forward. And as you're familiar with the tools, empathy, prototyping, and iteration, you essentially move between those poles: empathy, understanding what user needs are; prototyping, building at first a simple solution, but it can also be a sophisticated solution; and continually testing and learning. And again, in a design thinking environment, there are multiple possible answers, and in fact, what I would say, multiple possible novel answers, and that's the real advantage there. And then finally, in this, the last area I throw in there because I do a lot of work in this area as well, which is research thinking, or research problem solving. And there the emphasis is on logic and being able to build a logical case as you move forward. The tools are classical in nature, deduction, induction, abduction. And the goal is in any argument to find an internally consistent answer. And an internally consistent answer will, by either deductive or inductive logic tools, will make sense. But as we all know, it could possibly be an answer that doesn't matter. It could be an answer too small because the question was an inappropriate question. But what makes good, sound research problem solving is being able to logic your way forward. So now let's turn our attention to the next area, which is what we would call over and under thinking, and we'll explore some of the edges there. So why don't you head to the next slide, Jeremy?
Okay, and maybe just before I do that, Mark, can I?
Oh yeah.
Can I?
Sure.
Yeah, let me throw in my 2 bits here.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that Mark and I both think about a lot when we work with students is that students tend to not see, as we look at this nice kind of chart here, they tend to not see the diversity of possible outcomes. So, for example, engineering students tend to think, well, I know how to solve problems in this way, therefore all the possible outcomes, all the kind of outcomes I'm going to want are going to be single-point answers. But we know that's not the case, and so part of learning different thinking styles is realizing is thinking harder about the kind of outcome we want. And as we all know, we all have kind of privileged ways of thinking, and we tend to try to fit that thinking style onto all problems. And that's where using just one kind of tool can run you into trouble.
Exactly. And if you think in the world of, let's say, tools, hand tools, if you are very good with a saw, you are going to try to saw everything you find. And for some problems, sawing is exactly what you need. But for many other problems, it's disastrous. And when it comes to tools, you intuitively know I need a different tool. But ironically, when it comes to problem solving, you do not always know that you need, well, first of all, you're probably not aware of your own problem solving patterns. And then secondly, you don't think to use a different problem solving technique because you've never thought about problem solving as multiple pathways to an answer. So Jeremy, you're absolutely right. That's a terrific build.
Well, great.
Do you want to take us on to the next slide? Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
So go ahead.
Oh, okay, great. So how do we decide then when we're thinking about these? And often when we're talking about design thinking versus strategic thinking, we use this language of over and under thinking as kind of trying to identify what's wrong with a particular technique. And now we're bringing in some of the tools of design thinking, in some ways trying to approach the strategic versus design thinking in this way, trying to categorize them as over and under thinking is simply the wrong problem. It's the wrong way to think about this problem. And what we should be trying to figure out is how do we match the right thinking style to the problem being solved? What is the problem that we're worried about? And how can we identify the right thinking style that will help us achieve the kind of outcome that we need? Okay, so now should we go ahead and dive into the homework?
Yeah, let's dive into the homework. And
okay.
What we're going to do here is put some of the students on the spot. Leszek, we know you're in the audience, and so we may call on you, and you might open up your mic at that moment. And Dorota, who also completed the homework, we'll reference her, but I don't think she's here today. Is that right, Jeremy?
That's right. And I just got word that Leszek might be having a little trouble with his audio. He seems to be coming in and out, so I think he'll join us as he can.
Okay.
On that note, so we have several kinds of participants here today. There are several of you that are joining us directly through WebEx, and we encourage you to all use the chat. So down in the, I guess, the lower right-hand side, you'll see a chat window. Please feel free to ask Mark and I questions on the chat, but also we'd love to hear what you think about what we're talking about. So questions, but also reflections. We'd love to hear from you in the chat. Leszek, if you're here and you can hear us, but you can't talk, you might try to talk with us through the chat, and we can relate what you're saying.
We'll watch the chat window for that. That's great.
And then, Joanna, I'm putting you on the spot here, but because, Joanna, you have a group of people with you, and I think maybe they're all listening to your phone right now, the participants in the room, we'd be happy to hear from you about your thoughts. You could either jump in on the chat, or you could go commandeer Joanna's phone and talk to us directly. So please feel free to jump in as we move along. It looks like, Joanna, I'm seeing you online now. That's good. But we'd love to get some of your feedback as we move along today.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear,
Yes.
Joanna.
We can hear you, Joanna.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Perfect. So we don't have Dorota here in the room.
That's okay. Yeah, that's all right.
Unfortunately.
So we really want to focus on two examples today. So we asked you all to fill out a little bit of work before you began today in the webinar. We wanted you to tell us about a problem that you solved using design thinking, and then tell us about another problem that you've encountered, probably in your work, but maybe elsewhere in your life, where design thinking might not be the right approach, that maybe one of these other thinking styles, maybe strategic thinking, maybe research thinking, maybe business thinking, would be a better approach. So we wanted you to kind of start thinking a little bit about when design thinking really works effectively. And then finally, we wanted you to think about how it is, as a process, how you match your problem-solving style to the problems you face. In other words, how do you decide when you encounter a problem, what's the process you go through for determining the right way, the right problem-solving style to use in that particular situation. So that's what we asked you to think about. Several of you... Go ahead, Joanna.
I just wanted to comment that the first point that I would consider is the kind of the problem that we have to solve. Which means the wicked problem or not wicked problem, right? Which means if the problem is complicated and has many diverse contexts, stakeholders, and and it's we need to consider many different people to talk to and so on. This is the basic thing to start, right? And if the problem is quite simple or it has defined set of solutions, then I think it might be like wasting time to dig so deep and use this design thinking approach.
Great. Yeah, that's a great first stab at this, Joanna. This makes a lot of sense as a way to initially begin, is to think, am I confronted by a wicked problem, one that I know to be a wicked problem? Lots of stakeholders, the constraints aren't clear, lots of kind of variables. So yeah, great. So if you know in advance that it's a wicked problem you're facing, then you're probably thinking, design thinking is going to help you. And of course, if the problem seems really constrained, if it's a technical problem and you know the kind of question you're asking, then sure, then some other approach is going to be more valuable. And engineering's style problem-solving technique. Of course, the problem is, and it's the problem we saw as we worked together on design thinking, is that some problems appear to be fairly simple, appear to have fewer stakeholders, and in fact they don't, right? So sometimes we don't know when we're facing a wicked problem. And in fact, sometimes our bias towards this particular kind of problem solving will throw us into kind of looking for a single solution too early. We haven't thought enough about, are there other stakeholders involved? Are there other variables I haven't considered? Am I indeed solving the right problem? So this is part of the challenge of deliberating between problem-solving styles, is that often we're a little bit biased towards an approach we're the most familiar with. So if you go talk to a designer at the D-School, boy, all the problems they face are wicked problems, right? There's always a way to reframe the problem. So our biases can affect us here. Mark, do you have any thoughts here before we...
No, I think that's absolutely right. One of the things I think about when I try to frame this concept of different styles of problem solving is think about a bridge over a river. And if you're an engineer and you're charged with building a bridge over the river, you're going to build a truss bridge because it's the simplest, strongest, most tested, and easiest to calculate kind of bridge you're going to build across. If you're a business person, you're going to think about, well, should we build a bridge, or should we use a ferry, or how do we get goods from one side of the riverbank to the other? What should we think about? How many lanes should the bridge have? You'll be working between building the best bridge ever to building a bridge that's good enough just to get the goods to the other side, and you'll have those kind of conversations. And if you're a design thinker, you're going to start by saying, well, what do people want? What do they want? Well, they want to move goods from one side of the river to the other, but they're going to be looking at this thing for the rest of their lives, and should it give them some inspiration? Should it add value to other elements of their life? And you can see that depending on which thinking style you adopt, you come up with very different answers. And oh, by the way, every one of those answers is right. And so the challenge is deciding which tool you're going to use at what moment. And when you decide what bridge you want, for example, you want the engineers to figure out how to build that bridge. And you want the business people to figure out how to pay for it. You don't want the design thinkers doing that work, because they're going to lead to probably an answer with less confidence. So does that analogy make sense?
Yeah, that's great. Great, Mark. That's a great analogy.
Okay.
So as we move forward then, let's take a look at a couple of examples from the work that you participants did. As we do that, I think using Mark's kind of bridge model is a great one. As we look at these examples, we should kind of go through and think, how would an engineer think about this? How would a business person think about this? How would a design thinker think about this? How would a researcher think about this? What are the different styles, and how does that change the problem that we're talking about in each of these cases? So we want to start today by looking at an example. Leszek Chabowski did some...
And I've been able to connect with him via chat.
Oh, great.
And he's here, he's listening, and he has a question. But take us through what's on the slide first, and then we'll talk about the question.
Okay, great. So we asked all of you to think about a case where design thinking is particularly useful. So this is just the first part of the work that we asked you to do. And Leszek had a great problem, which is a large social problem, probably in Poland, but certainly in the United States, and increasingly so. And that's, how do you encourage children to eat fruits and vegetables? Children very rarely need encouragement to drink soda pop and potato chips. That's not a problem we need to solve. But fruits and vegetables, yes.
If you're a parent of children, as lots of kids, this is a wicked problem.
This is a wicked problem. Yeah, and Leszek told us why he thinks this problem is a design thinking problem. He says design thinking is a good way to solve different kinds of social problems, designing new developments and creating human-machine interfaces. So Leszek is thinking that where design thinking is most valuable is when we're dealing with something which we might call a social problem, right, where we're thinking of some new approach or a new development, thinking of some new way to approach the problem that involves more of a social network and concentrates on relations between people is the right way to go. Does Leszek's question fit here now?
Leszek's question was, what he's struggling with is, okay, you can become familiar with different ways of doing design thinking, but how do you know when's the right moment to use one style of thinking over another? And I think as we move through the presentation, we hope that you'll get a sense for that. But one of the ways is to ask yourself, what would design thinking lend itself to as an answer for this problem? And what would engineering thinking or business thinking lend itself to it? And so it's being familiar with thinking styles and sort of guessing the kind of answer you're going to come up with without knowing exactly, and deciding if that's really the kind of answer you want for the problem. And I think that's how you end up choosing. It's an iterative process where you first sort of roughly try out different thinking styles and then go from there. I don't think I would want engineers, for example, to think about a way to encourage children to eat fruits and vegetables, because it would likely involve a robot, and that would not be pretty.
Good. That's great, Mark. First, Leszek, that's a wonderful question. I think it's the question that is on all of our minds, right, is how do we know, and in particular, how when we start a problem, when we've taken an approach, how do we know it's the right approach? How do we know when to switch? And I think Mark's right that it's something that we have to kind of constantly hold in our minds, both as we're thinking about the problem and moving through a particular kind of problem-solving style. We also have to kind of keep our eyes out on the outcome at all times. Is this the kind of outcome we want, right? So we've got to kind of have a dual track thinking and constantly keeping that the kind of outcome we want in the forefront of our heads.
Yeah, and that's why when we expose engineers to design thinking, they find it so amazing. And the reason they find it amazing is because they weren't really aware that there were other ways to problems than how they were solving the problem, which is using engineering thinking. And when they're exposed to a new and novel way of solving problems, it really opens their eyes and opens the window to doing that. And then, of course, once you get comfortable doing design thinking and engineering thinking, you suddenly realize that, oh my gosh, there are other kinds of thinking out there. business thinking and research thinking, and the list goes on. And so to become an effective manager and problem solver, you really need to have more tools in your toolkit, and that's what this is about.
Great. So let's now let's ask Leszek again to think about. He wrote. Oh, actually, we have another example we ought to look at, and I think this is a great one. Dorota Wisniewska. I think I probably ruined that name. Sorry, Dorota. We asked Dorota, where is design thinking useful? And I think she came up with a really great answer. I'm a bicyclist myself, so I think a lot about this. Determining the number of stops on a bike route. So this is a problem that Dorota identified where design thinking would be useful. Why did she think so? Well, this kind of problem, you need a teamwork environment. You've got to really think hard about what the problem is, and then you need something to help you review whether the solution made sense or not. So this is a classic wicked problem, a classic design thinking kind of problem, where the initial goal is to figure out how many stops on a bicycle route. A design thinker is going to immediately start thinking, do we have the right problem? Should we be worried about stops on a bike route? Is bike route the right way to go? Who's involved? Should we talk to these people? I think all of you out there who have ridden a bicycle either on the Stanford campus while you came and visited us or back at home where you are in Poland, you might find that people who design bike lanes or bike parking have clearly never been on a bicycle before, right? So there's a kind of a stakeholder question. And so I think this is a great example of good design thinking. But let's now turn to some situations where design thinking maybe isn't very appropriate, or is not very useful, where maybe strategic thinking or some other kind of thinking would be more valuable. And again, as we're looking at these examples, please weigh in on the chat. Joanna, please feel free to jump in, or those of you who are in the room with Joanna, we'd love to hear from you, so feel free to grab the mic and throw in your 2 bits. Mark and I want to hear what you have to say.
Recognizing that we do have about 10 more minutes, that's it.
That's true, yeah. We don't have a lot more time, but we want to make sure that we hear from as many of you as possible as we move along. Okay, so let's go back to Leszek. Leszek gave us an example of a problem where design thinking is probably not the right approach. And this is a wonderful example. Leszek asked, how should we optimally improve pollutant emissions in exhaust gas for a diesel engine? This is a wonderful problem. Okay, Joanna, I hear you on the phone.
Yes.
Yes,
I have Mrs. Katie Kavanagh with us, who is our expert of DT Week in Poland this year, and she would like to comment. So I'm giving her the phone. The speaker.
Great, welcome, Kate.
Push this.
Hi, gents. We've never had the pleasure of meeting at Stanford, so I'm happy to meet you here. I've been coaching design thinking both at Stanford and here at the Hasso-Plattner Institute in Potsdam, and now I'm a free agent and happy to be here in Poland. I feel that the multidisciplinarity of design thinking is what is most unique to this form of design. From my understanding, designers, of course, did use consultants or would, oh, what's that? Just, would consult with others in other fields, but having a multidisciplinary team and perhaps even users on the team is what is most unique about design thinking. Could you confirm or agree or disagree with me?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Go ahead and comment on that.
Sure. Maybe I'll take a first stab, Mark, and then leave it to you. I think you're totally right. And even in the examples that we've just seen, right, I think Leszek's first example about fruits and vegetables with children, there's clearly not one disciplinary background which is going to really nail that problem, right? Or thinking about a bike route, right? There's a lot of kind of social as well as technical concerns. It's clearly not one discipline. Then as we look at this problem that we have in front of us here, Leszek's problem about pollutant emissions, we're starting to look like closer to a single disciplinary approach. So, Katie, I think you're totally right. Design thinking really excels when there's got to be different disciplines and different traditions that work together, and they've got to figure out a way to work together. So I think you're totally right on there. Mark?
Yeah, I think you're on the right path, but I'm probably not as enthusiastic as Jeremy about this, because I would tell you, for example, well, I would agree that the design thinking lends itself to multidisciplinary teams in their function. That's clearly true. But at the same time, other thinking styles are accommodating of different disciplines. So, for example, business thinking. It's very common in the business world when you're sitting around the table to have people of different disciplines sitting around the table making common decisions. So that happens as well. It happens less so in engineering because the technical knowledge is sort of so specific, and it's probably less accommodating, certainly, than design thinking in that area. But either way, the reason I would disagree is that I would like to think that regardless of your discipline, you could begin to adopt different thinking styles so that even if you're an engineer, and I don't mean that in any kind of demeaning way, but even if you're an engineer, you can learn to think about problems in a different sort of way using engineering tools, using engineering ways of solving problems. So yes, I would say you're on the right path, but it's probably not as cut and dried as it may seem.
Back to you, Katie. Do you want to? Yeah, go ahead.
From my experience, I would agree that other styles of design are necessary. I produced a design thinking conference in Potsdam, and we started out, of course, generating ideas with design thinking, but when it came down to a deadline, we had to jump on a production schedule. And, well, some members were still doing a design thinking model. Right. But, yeah, we have to agree on using multiple styles. And I have to agree with you, gents, that we must be flexible. And that is also one of the modes or agreements about design thinking, is that we do need to remain flexible with it. And does that sound wishy-washy to you, or?
No. I think that's exactly the right perspective and temperament. Yeah, that's perfect.
And Mark, just to weigh in here, you know, I'm more of a design thinker than I am an engineer. You know that from your everyday work with me. But one of the things that I really like about design thinking, even though it's not always the right problem-solving style for all problems, is that design thinking in itself as an approach sometimes tells you that design thinking isn't the right approach, that it's using design thinking often that we realize, oh, I've been solving the wrong kind of problem. Maybe a business approach would be stronger here. And so partly one of the strengths of especially the early stages, right, empathy and redefining those initial stages often tell you, oh, I should be using a different problem-solving style. And so,
yeah, and frankly, the other problem-solving styles will do the same. So, for example, you can use business thinking and not have successful results, and you can do that several times and say, you know, I need to come up with a different idea, so I'm going to go to Stanford D-School and spend a week thinking about it. Or you can even do engineering problem solving and never get a satisfactory overall solution. So yeah, you're right. Usually failure is the greatest teacher of all in every sense.
Great. Well, let's push on. We don't have much more time here. Maybe 5 more minutes if we can go a few minutes longer. I want to take a quick look at Dorota's example of where design thinking isn't useful. She says that sales management, problems with product diversification, problems that need close tracking of the execution of activities. And she suggests that this method is better for product development than for product diversification or sales management. So, Mark, I know you've had a lot of experience in this area before. would you agree this is not a good design thinking area?
Yeah, well, it's hard to totally dismiss design thinking because, as you point out, there are parts of it that make sense. But even as Katie was talking about, there comes a time when you just got to go out and do it, and what you need to do is pretty clear. How you're going to do it maybe isn't so clear, but you got to do it, and that may not be the time to go all the way back and reconsider empathy and ideate, and you know what you got to do, so just go do it. And there are situations in life that lend themselves to that process. So I would definitely agree with Dorota here.
Great. Well, so again, we'd love to hear from you, Joanna or Katie or others of you in the room. We're going to keep on plowing on here, but please feel free to jump in either on chat or using the audio. The final area that we were going to talk about is trying to get you all to think about how it is that you choose. So how do you begin? So we've talked about a few problems which seem appropriate for different thinking styles or problem-solving styles. How do you choose? It looks like Joanna
this is essentially Leszek's question.
Okay, good. How do you choose? Is there someone, Joanna, that is wanting to talk on your side of things?
Okay, professors, we have another professor here. So Professor Monkers is ready to discuss with you. He has some comments to make, okay?
Sure,
great.
Absolutely.
Okay, this is Piotr. Since I couldn't make the meeting where you are sitting, I went to Gdańsk to meet with you.
That voice sounds so familiar.
Well, welcome, Piotr. Great to hear from
you. have a brother in the United States?
It better sound familiar unless your memory is failing. Okay, you guys look great on the screen, and we need to see you here more often.
I agree.
Very nice. So I think that the method that you are using, I'm sort of watching the performance from this side of specific topics, picked narrow topics, short analysis of it is a great method. When I sat with you there, I wasn't appreciating as much as I appreciated from here, because one can focus only that long on two of you speaking. So that's wonderful. Thank you very much. Thanks. Greetings.
Great, Piotr.
Jeremy, I think our time has come to an end.
Okay, maybe we should do a little bit of a wrap here. I guess, Mark, you want to take a first shot? I guess I was going to say just maybe I'll take 1 minute to say my piece, and then maybe you say how you would advise or recommend people choosing a problem-solving style. I think what we've learned today is that we do have some initial clues, right? I think Joanna's initial idea about starting with the idea of, do we have a wicked problem, or do we have a more closed-ended problem? That's a great approach. And I think also a lot of the clues that we saw, thinking about disciplines, thinking about how many stakeholders we have, right? So we have a lot of initial clues as we gather information about a problem in order to determine what that problem-solving style is. And I guess, Mark, my advice would be that, one of the most important things that we found is to try to diversify the toolkit. So one of the problems that people have in choosing a problem-solving style is that they often don't have very many tools to choose from. If you're an engineer and you only do engineering things, then you're going to always think that that's the right problem-solving style. So I guess the first step in being able to choose well is to have an ample set of choices. And I think that's one of the things that Mark and I have encouraged you all to do, and that we try to do in our own work, is try to expand the set of problem-solving styles that we have. The more tools that we have to choose from, the more we're going to be able to see when we see a new problem, think, oh, well, actually, this is more of a business kind of a problem. So I think that's my initial advice, is what we need to do first is expand the toolkit. Okay, Mark, what about you?
That's exactly right. And Jeremy, if you can pop back to slide 11,
Sure.
A way of thinking about this is to say, what kind of answer do I need? If I think there is one calculably right answer, then engineering thinking is a good tool to use. If I think that there could be multiple answers and I have to decide between, what's the best answer and what's a sufficient answer, well, then maybe business problem-solving style. And if I need a novel answer, something that's completely new and different, design thinking could be the way to go. So what I tend to do is start with the answer. Even though I don't know the answer, I can kind of guess what type of answer I'm going to want, and that will oftentimes lead to a style of thinking that is part of this. But ultimately, the issue comes down to what we were hoping to do in this webinar, is to say that design thinking is one style of thinking. It's very powerful. It's not right in every situation, but it's an important tool to have in your own problem-solving toolkit, as well as others. And what we hope you do is that you see problem-solving as matching up with the kind of tools for problem-solving that might happen, and that you start a lifelong journey to build your own personal toolkit with different kinds of problem-solving styles that help you make the best decision in any given situation. And that really is the very simple message behind our webinar today. How's that?
Wonderful. So we're going to say goodbye to all of you now. Mark and I will make sure that you have access to the great article by Professor Doss or Kingshar Doss before we go or after we go today. But we also just want to thank you for including us in your Design Thinking Week. It's been great to be involved. It sounds like it was a great success. We're impressed with the work that Joanna and her team have done, and it sounds like you guys had a great experience, and we just want to thank you for including us in your great event.
Dear professors, we thank you very much for the webinar. I'm happy we've made it because the presentation and your speech was really interesting, and even though we had some problems before, we have big spirit, and we hope to see the future with design thinking in Poland with you. Okay.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
And maybe Joanna, to you and everyone with you, Mark and I are excited that this is a continuation of a conversation, and we want to keep talking about these kinds of problems and these kinds of solutions with you ongoing. So we're looking forward to that in the future.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye, Joanna.
Bye-bye.